Okay, hello everybody. David Ansardi here, back again, and I am going to be discussing the autonomic nervous system with you during this lecture. So this is your 7th lecture for Unit 4. And so let's go ahead and get started. So you guys have already learned that your nervous system can be divided both structurally and functionally, or anatomically and functionally. And so hopefully you recall that hopefully I can recall how to use the pen. Hang on just a second. Y'all, it's Thursday evening, and so I'm even more senile than usual, so I will probably seem extra spacey while going through this lecture. So just bear with me. Nervous system is divided anatomically into the central nervous system, brain and the spinal cord, and then your peripheral nervous system, which consists of all of those nerves that contain both sensory incoming axons and the outgoing axons of motor neurons that extend out to all the different parts of your body. Okay, so your peripheral nervous system, as you've learned, is divided into the sensory division, that's information coming inward to the central nervous system for processing, and then your motor division, which consists of the motor neurons that are sending impulses outward to generate responses from your central nervous system. Okay? Motor division is divided into the somatic nervous system, which controls things like skeletal muscle contractions, which you've heard lots and lots about. And then tonight, I'm going to be talking to you about the autonomic nervous system, which is abbreviated ANS. Autonomic referring to involuntary, subconscious. This branch of your nervous system controls things for you that help you maintain homeostasis, which of course you've heard a lot about during Biology 201, without you having to think about it. Okay, so think involuntary. Think control of things like most of your major organs, glands, things that function without you having to give it a second thought. Now, you've already heard, I know in your first lecture, you heard about how the autonomic nervous system is divided into a sympathetic division and a parasympathetic division. So you have these two different branches, and in general, these two branches generate opposite responses from each other when they're controlling things like glands and your major organs, like your heart or the organs of your digestive system, etc. And an easy way to kind of keep track of what these two branches do in general, the sympathetic branch is generally involved in what we call fight or flight responses, and your parasympathetic branch is active for rest and digest. Okay, so that's kind of an easy way to, in general, keep track of what these different branches of your autonomic nervous system do. Fight or flight for your sympathetic nervous system. So if you think about, you get into a stressful situation, like maybe you're being chased by an alien, think about how your body reacts. Your heart rate is going to elevate. Your blood pressure is going to go up. You're going to breathe really hard. Your pupils are going to dilate. You're probably going to become flushed because your body is trying to extend more blood flow to your muscles and to your skin. You're going to start sweating. Those are all heavy-duty reactions due to activity or stimulation from the sympathetic branch of the nervous system. And so sometimes we call that fight or flight, the fight or flight branch, because if it's really working to extremes, it's going to generate responses that would help you in a stressful type situation. Now, that doesn't mean it's only active when you're in a stressful situation. It just means when you are, it's especially active. The parasympathetic branch, on the other hand, we tend to think of it as the activity of that branch helping restore you to a normal state or a state of resting rather than stress. And the reason why we say rest and digest, as it turns out, the parasympathetic branch actually stimulates your digestive activity. Okay, so what are some things that the ANS does for you in general? And first of all, it consists primarily of motor neurons that do the following things. Those motor neurons, which are their cell bodies, like you learned about for the motor neurons that stimulate your skeletal muscles. They're located in the spinal cord or up in your brain. Their axons that extend out will eventually innervate smooth and cardiac muscle and glands. So not skeletal muscle, but the smooth muscle that's located in the walls of most of your major organs, like the organs of your digestive tract, or even within your blood vessels, you have smooth muscle that allows those to constrict or relax. And your cardiac muscle, so these branches of the ANS helps control your heart rate. It's involved in homeostasis control because it makes adjustments to ensure that your bodily activities are functioning optimally for you. And the other key thing, again, though, guys, is the ANS is subconscious. These are things that are happening without you really having to think about them. This diagram from your textbook is making a comparison for you between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system branches. Okay, so both of these are part of your motor division. So that's all the outgoing signals out to other parts of your body away from the central nervous system. But they're making a comparison here about these two branches and how they function and how they're structured. Okay, so the somatic nervous system, this is what you've learned about before, the motor neurons that are reaching out and their axons are extending to skeletal muscles and stimulating those to contract. So you've learned about before that when those neurons generate action potentials, their effect is stimulatory. They're stimulating skeletal muscle fibers to contract. That's what you've learned about before. Here's what we're talking about now. Your autonomic nervous system consists of these two different branches, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And these two branches tend to have opposite effects from one another. So if one tends to ramp something up, the other branch will wind up ramping it down. And notice the targets over here. I'm not going to talk about all this stuff in the middle just yet. If you notice the targets for these two branches, rather than skeletal muscle, the axons from these neurons of the ANS wind up extending to smooth muscle, especially in the digestive organs of your gut, glands, cardiac muscle. But notice over here, the effects on the targets can be either stimulatory or inhibitory. It just depends on the branch. Also depends on the neurotransmitters that are released by that particular branch. Okay, something else that is different from what you learned about when you were studying motor neurons that stimulate skeletal muscles to contract. The autonomic nervous system over here, you always have a chain of two neurons extending to a particular target. So you have a two neuron chain from the central nervous system to the effector organ, which is a fancy way of saying the target. What is that? What are those neurons trying to stimulate or inhibit? Okay, so in the sympathetic branch you see here, we have a couple of example neurons that are participating in your sympathetic branch. These neurons that you see here would be located in the central nervous system. Their cell bodies are either in the spinal cord or in the brain. Here are their axons. there's the synaptic knob on the end of the axon. Notice that the axons are lightly myelinated in contrast to the axons of motor neurons that extend to your skeletal muscles, which tend to be very heavily myelinated. And then notice here that the synaptic knob there is forming a synapse with the cell body of a second neuron in this first case. Okay? So this neuron is releasing a neurotransmitter that is stimulating this second neuron to generate an action potential or a nerve impulse. Okay? And then once that happens, this second neuron releases a neurotransmitter that will wind up having an effect on the intended target. So this synaptic knob here will be forming a synapse with, say, smooth muscle found in the walls of blood vessels, or within, like they're showing you here, within the walls of the organs of the digestive tract. So you have that 2-neuron chain, and the cell bodies of the second neuron in that 2-neuron chain, those are actually located in ganglia. Ganglion is singular, ganglia is plural. Now, hopefully you have already learned about the dorsal root ganglia within the dorsal branch or the dorsal root of spinal nerves as they approach the spinal cord. And hopefully you learned that the swelling there on the dorsal root, you have that swelling there because the cell bodies of sensory neurons are located there. Same thing here. A ganglion is going to be a swollen area of nerve tissue outside of the central nervous system. So it's going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. And you have this swelling there because you have a whole bunch of cell bodies from these second neurons in these 2-neuron chains. Okay, I'm going to erase that because that's getting kind of complicated. Look at this other diagram here. Here's another motor neuron involved in the sympathetic nervous system. And notice its axon is actually extending to the adrenal gland. And it's forming a synapse there with the adrenal gland, and it's stimulating the adrenal gland to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Alternative names for those are adrenaline and noradrenaline. You will hear more about that when you take Biology 202. And in fact, you're going to hear a lot about the autonomic nervous system throughout Biology 202 because the autonomic nervous system plays a very important role in controlling the functions of many of the major organ systems that you will be studying in your second semester of A&P. Okay, and if we look at this diagram here, here's a little diagrammatic representation of a 2-neuron chain within the parasympathetic branch. Same thing again, you've got a first neuron whose cell body is going to be located in the central nervous system. It has a long axon that's extending outward and forming a synapse with a second neuron whose cell body is located in a ganglion. This one stimulates the second neuron. This second neuron then is releasing neurotransmitters, which are controlling targets. Okay, so think 2-neuron chains with the autonomic nervous system. Well, let's take a closer look at the sympathetic division of the ANS. This diagram looks kind of complicated, and you're not going to have to know a lot of the nitty-gritty details here. But the axons of neurons involved in the sympathetic division. Now remember, you got a 2-neuron chain. The first neurons in those chains, their cell bodies are located in the spinal cord between spinal nerve regions T1 to L2 at those levels. So that's where the axons of the first neurons come outward. Okay, and then where are the cell bodies of those second neurons in the chain located? Many of them are located in a structure that's called the sympathetic trunk or the sympathetic chain of ganglia. And on this diagram, they're showing this more or less separated from the spinal cord, but if you actually look at it in a more anatomically correct diagram or on a cadaver, you would see it's actually pretty close to the spinal cord itself. Okay, so this is a little chain of ganglia located just outside the spinal cord, and this is where the cell bodies for the second neurons tend to be located. And then what they're showing you here, we'll change colors for a second. These little lines that are extending out to various places like the eyes, the lacrimal glands that produce tears, the heart, the lungs, etc. Those are the axons of the second neuron, and they're actually reaching out and contacting the smooth muscle within the organs to stimulate contraction or to allow it to relax, or to particular glands, etc. Some of the ganglia where the second neurons in the chains are located are not within this sympathetic trunk or chain. Some of them are located in little clusters of neuron cell bodies located outside that chain. And these are in the abdominopelvic cavity. So they have names like the celiac ganglion, the superior mesenteric ganglion, located near the intestines, inferior mesenteric ganglion near the lower portion of the intestines. Okay, and again, I know that diagram looks really complicated, and you don't need to know all the nitty-gritty details, but just some of the highlights that I pointed out are important for you to understand. Okay, let's zoom in a little bit more. So over here, I was kind of giving you the whole picture of the sympathetic division and how the axons from the first neuron reach out and form a synapse with the cell bodies of the second neuron located in these ganglia. But let's zoom in and see a closer example. So in this example, we have right here the cell body of the first neuron, which that, by the way, is often called the preganglionic neuron, the first one. Okay, so if it is trying to generate a response, it's going to send a nerve impulse along its axon. Just like the motor neurons you learned about that control skeletal muscles, the axons of these types of neurons exit the spinal cord through the ventral root. They enter the spinal nerve, but then pretty quickly, they'll take a detour, and they enter this ganglia chain located along the spinal cord. So we're still following the axon of that first neuron, and here it is forming a synapse with the cell body of the second neuron in the chain. So this neuron is going to stimulate an action potential on the second neuron that will travel down its axon. And notice it winds up re-entering the spinal nerve and extends outward to whatever happens to be the target of that particular axon. So it could be in the skin, it might be sweat glands, it might be the erector pili muscles you learned about in the skin, it may be smooth muscle in blood vessels if you're trying to stimulate those blood vessels to constrict. Okay? Make sure I didn't skip something here. Okay. Now, what about the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system? In general, same kind of deal for the most part. The cell bodies of the first neuron in your two-neuron chain are located, though, associated with certain cranial nerves that branch off from the brain or the brain stem. And those actually include cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. Cranial nerve 10, by the way, is one that pair of cranial nerves you will hear a whole lot about in Biology 202, because those are actually your vagus nerves that extend all the way from your brainstem down into your thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities and help control the functions of many of your major organs. Okay, axons of other neurons, first neurons in the two neuron sequences for the parasympathetic division. Some others branch off from levels S2 to S4, down at the sacral level of the spinal cord through the sacral nerves, S2 through S4. And those are neurons that are controlling things like your genitals and your urinary tract. And a few of them actually also control the function of your rectal area as well. This is misspelled. That should be ganglionic, not ganglionic. So the first neurons in these two neuron sequences, the first one's preganglionic neuron. The second one in the chain is called the ganglionic neuron. I should have mentioned that earlier. Now, when we talked about the sympathetic division, like over here, the cell bodies of the second neuron in the chain, they're often located in ganglia that are pretty far away from the targets. So the axons of these second neurons may travel a whole long way out to whatever they're trying to stimulate or inhibit, depending on their jobs. In your parasympathetic division, the second neurons, or the ganglionic neurons, are generally located in ganglia that are really, really, really super close to the organs that they're trying to control. So you will have ganglia containing cell bodies of neurons really, really close to the heart, or to the lungs, or to the liver, or to the stomach, or to the pancreas. They're up there really, really close to their target organs. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of an overview about the structure, the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. And it's important to remember that you have the two neuron chains when you're thinking about the ANS. Now let's talk about the neurotransmitters that are used in the ANS. You've heard about neurotransmitters before because you learned about the function of acetylcholine, or ACH. You heard a lot about that because that is the neurotransmitter that is released from the synaptic knobs of motor neurons that control skeletal muscle contraction. And now we're actually going to be hearing about this neurotransmitter again. And you've also learned about the functions of other neurotransmitters from Miss Nicholas's lecture, which was 4.5 in this particular unit. So different neurons can release different neurotransmitters into their synapses, which then bind to receptors on their targets and generate some kind of change or response inside that target cell. So let's take a look at the neurotransmitters used by your autonomic nervous system. Okay, so we've got our two neuron chains that we're looking at again. Let's look at this one first. This is a two neuron chain within your sympathetic nervous system. Here's your first neuron, and notice that when it generates an action potential, it is going to release acetylcholine into the synapse between it and the second neuron in the chain. So it's using acetylcholine just like your motor neurons that control skeletal muscle. This acetylcholine will bind to receptors on this second neuron, the ganglionic neuron, and that will stimulate an action potential along the axon of the second neuron. Now this is the synaptic knob that is going to be forming a synapse with the target organ or the target gland. And from the end of that neuron, you're going to release NE, which is an abbreviation, if you look down here, for norepinephrine, or noradrenaline is another name for that. Okay, then NE, or norepinephrine, binds to receptors on the target organs and stimulates some response inside those organs. Okay, and you guys are familiar with how adrenaline acts on your body. It has effects that remind you of what I was talking about when I mentioned fight or flight at the beginning of the lecture, and that's because that is the neurotransmitter that is used within the sympathetic branch to bind to the targets that it is trying to control. All right, let me erase all of that. Now let's look at what's going on over here with the parasympathetic, the two neurons in that chain. First neuron also releases acetylcholine from its synaptic knobs, which binds to receptors present on the surface of the second neuron. And notice the second neuron also releases acetylcholine from its synaptic knobs, which will then act on the targets. Okay, that brings up a couple of questions. Well, how can you just keep using these same neurotransmitters to do different jobs? So we're going to talk about that. And also you're noticing, hopefully, that the sympathetic branch, the neurotransmitter that's actually going to act on the target, is different from the neurotransmitter that's acting on the target that's been produced by the parasympathetic branch. And that gets back to the fact that the effects that these two branches have on their targets are usually opposite from each other. So one will stimulate, whereas the other one will inhibit. And so that's what makes it good that you have two different types of neurotransmitters being released by these two different branches of the autonomic nervous system. That way, the target will respond in one way to norepinephrine, usually stimulation, and will respond in a different way to acetylcholine, usually inhibition. So how does this work? Now, you guys, you've learned before that acetylcholine here stimulates skeletal muscles to contract. Now, down here, you're seeing acetylcholine being used by the parasympathetic branch of your nervous system very often to inhibit the contraction of things like cardiac muscle, to make those contractions happen less frequently and less strongly. You'll learn about that in Biology 202. Well, so how does that happen? How can acetylcholine stimulate skeletal muscles to contract while inhibiting contraction or function of other types of muscle within the body? Okay, and the way that works is that different cells, different target tissues within your body produce different types of receptors that bind to acetylcholine. Okay? So you can have, like, let's say this is a skeletal muscle fiber here. So it's going to have receptors for acetylcholine, and then maybe over here in some smooth muscle cell and some in the walls of an important organ or in the walls of a blood vessel, over there you're going to have a different type of acetylcholine receptor. They may have somewhat different shapes, but they're both are going to be able to bind to acetylcholine. They're going to have a little pocket in there that will bind that chemical. The other thing that's important is once acetylcholine comes together with these receptors, that generates a response in the target cells, and the responses that are generated will be different in different types of target cells. They're not always going to be the same. So these different types of acetylcholine receptors that can exist on different target tissues are divided up into two types. You have nicotinic receptors and you have muscarinic receptors. These are different types of receptors on different target tissues. They both bind the same neurotransmitter, acetylcholine. The name for this one, yes, it does actually come from nicotine, and that's because the nicotine in cigarettes binds to these particular receptors. Where do you have nicotinic type acetylcholine receptors? The acetylcholine receptors you learned about in Unit 3 when you were studying the muscular system, those are nicotinic type receptors for acetylcholine. All ganglionic neurons of the autonomic nervous system. So if we go back and look at this diagram, if you notice here, the cell bodies of the second neurons used in the chains for both sympathetic and parasympathetic branches are reacting to acetylcholine. They bind acetylcholine. Okay, and those are nicotinic type receptors. Hormone-producing cells of the adrenal medulla, you will learn more about that in Biology 202. And in all of these cases, notice that acetylcholine binding is stimulatory. So you're stimulating an action potential to be generated on the second neuron, or you're stimulating skeletal muscle contraction. The other type of acetylcholine receptor that can exist on other types of targets are called muscarinic receptors. Okay, so if you look over here, when we were looking at these second neurons, the ganglionic neurons, the ones that are involved in the sympathetic branch secrete norepinephrine to their targets. The ones involved in the parasympathetic branch, they also secrete acetylcholine. Okay, so the targets for these neurons must have acetylcholine receptors on their surfaces if they're going to react to that. Those types of receptors are called muscarinic receptors. Okay, and so they're a little bit different from nicotinic receptors, and when you have acetylcholine binding to those, the responses in those targets will be different. Interestingly, depending on the target, wherever you're located, acetylcholine binding to a muscarinic receptor can be stimulatory or it can be inhibitory. It just depends on the particular target. This winds up being important. Okay, so nicotine, I just mentioned, binds to these types of receptors. Okay, and if you look over here, that means nicotine is going to be binding to the acetylcholine receptors, those nicotinic receptors on the second neurons in these two neuron chains. That's going to wind up activating these neurons that are part of your ANS. So that's what leads to things like your increasing heart rate, your increasing blood pressure, the redness that you can experience due to vasodilation that occurs from nicotine binding to those receptors. Atropine, the drug atropine, which maybe you've heard about before, it actually blocks acetylcholine binding to the muscarinic receptors. So by doing so, it tends to lower the activities of your parasympathetic branch. So you're downing the function of the parasympathetic branch. That leads to what atropine does. It causes your pupils to dilate. That's because the sympathetic branch of your nervous system tends to stimulate pupil dilation. Imagine if you were being chased by a bear in the dark. You would want your pupils to dilate so that you would be able to see as well as you possibly could in the dark so that you could get away from the bear. Atropine also prevents salivation. The sympathetic branch of your nervous system tends to reduce salivation because saliva formation is important for digestive function. And when you're in a fight or flight situation, your digestive system tends to ramp down because you don't need to digest food when you're in a stressful situation. You need to divert your blood flow and resources to helping you survive. And you guys know if you get into a stressful situation, sometimes you get dry mouth. It might become difficult to swallow or talk, and that's due to the activity of your sympathetic branch. Oh, and I forgot to mention, receptors that bind acetylcholine are sometimes called cholinergic receptors. The choline there in cholinergic coming from the name acetylcholine. Okay, what about NE, norepinephrine? Let me go back to this little diagram over here. Norepinephrine, you see here, is secreted by the second neurons of the sympathetic branch. Okay, and again, that branch of your autonomic nervous system does things, tends to ramp most things up, increases your breathing rate, increases your heart rate, increases your blood pressure, things that dilates your pupils, does things that help you survive in a fight or flight type situation. Okay, the receptors that bind to norepinephrine, there are different types on different targets, and they're called adrenergic receptors. This coming from adrenaline. And NE, norepinephrine, another name for that is noradrenaline. There are two broad types of receptors that can bind norepinephrine. They're broken down into two groups, alpha and beta. And again, they're going to be present on different types of tissues throughout the body. In your textbook, there is a table in this chapter, chapter 14, which goes through these different receptor types. You might want to take a look at those and explains where those subtypes are located and what happens when norepinephrine binds to these particular types of receptors. The alpha type receptors can actually be broken down into two closely related subtypes, alpha 1 and alpha 2. Interestingly, a lot of your over-the-counter medications that you take for colds, allergies, etc., they work by stimulating these alpha adrenergic receptors. So they can do things like stimulate your respiratory passages to dilate, to help you breathe better. The beta type receptors for norepinephrine, which can be divided up into three subtypes, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3, that will be located on different types of tissues. They bind norepinephrine, and this will lead to things such as dilation of the bronchioles in your lungs, or can one particular type of receptor, when it is located on the cardiac muscle in your heart, and when it binds norepinephrine, your heart rate will be stimulated to increase, and those cardiac muscle cells in your heart will contract more forcefully. And again, you're going to learn a lot more about that in Biology 202. Now, there are drugs that we take that act by blocking the activity of norepinephrine binding to these types of receptors. Some of you may have heard of beta blockers before. There are different types of beta blocker drugs, and what they do is they bind to these beta receptors, and by doing that, they prevent norepinephrine from binding. Okay, and so then the sympathetic nervous system activity on those target organs winds up being reduced. So these beta blockers can be used to do things like cause lung bronchioles to dilate rather than constrict. Norepinephrine might cause those to constrict. The beta blocker, though, is causing them to dilate in asthmatics. Something else that beta blockers can do, another type, is reduce the contraction force of the cardiac muscle in your heart. So if you know somebody who has blood pressure problems, one type of blood pressure medication is called a beta blocker, because that's how it acts to help reduce your blood pressure. One final little interesting topic, which is not so much entirely autonomic nervous system related, but since we are talking about how this branch of your nervous system extends to the major organs in your thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities, something that's interesting. So you have sensory neurons, axons of sensory neurons that extend away from all of these major organs, and those axons travel through the same peripheral nerves that pain-sensing sensory neurons coming from your skin and muscle travel through as well. So they're traveling together through the same nerves back towards your spinal cord and brain for processing. So what happens is this can lead to referred pain. Okay, so for example, we've all heard before how when somebody's having a heart attack and you have this pain that's being generated or you're sensing around your heart, a lot of times that pain extends down your left arm. The reason for that is because the axons of these sensory neurons involved in pain that are traveling to the CNS from the heart are traveling through the same spinal nerves as these axons from sensory neurons incoming from the left arm, from the muscle and skin tissue of the left arm. So what happens is your brain starts to misinterpret this. And so, yeah, you have pain coming in from the heart due to a heart attack, but your brain begins to not be able to tell whether those pain signals are coming just from the heart or also coming from these muscles and skin tissue located down your left arm. So when you have, when your brain is misinterpreting the location of these pain signals due to this common wiring between the two different locations, that is called referred pain. And there are many different examples of that. And they're kind of highlighting that for you here on the diagram. For example, interestingly, if you're having gallbladder problems, you can wind up with shoulder pain as referred pain, which seems kind of strange, but that's because the incoming axons of sensory neurons from the gallbladder have a common pathway with the axons of sensory neurons from muscle and skin tissue in the shoulder. So when you hear about referred pain, that is what is causing that. Okay, so that concludes my lecture on the autonomic nervous system. I'm sure this was quite a bit longer than what I had planned. And again, this is an introduction for you. You're going to wind up hearing a lot more about the autonomic nervous system throughout Biology 202. And when you apply it to these different organ systems, a lot of it will become a lot more understandable for you. All right, well, thanks a lot and take care. Bye-bye.